It was a warm Saturday afternoon when Danielle decided to stop by the jewelry store. The sunlight outside was golden and cheerful, spilling through the wide glass windows of the boutique. She had spent the morning running errands and hadn't planned on shopping for anything special. But as she walked past the store, a glittering display of bracelets in the window caught her eye. The way the diamonds shimmered under the soft lights felt like they were quietly calling her name. Danielle wasn't dressed in anything fancy that day. She wore a plain cream-colored cardigan over a simple blouse and a pair of comfortable jeans. Her shoes were practical flats, the kind you could walk in for hours without feeling tired. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she carried a small tote bag she had owned for years. Nothing about her outfit screamed wealth or status. She looked like any other woman enjoying a weekend stroll. Inside the boutique, the atmosphere was very different from the busy street outside. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers, and soft classical music played in the background. The lighting was designed to make the jewelry sparkle with almost magical brilliance. Rows of glass cases displayed rings, earrings, necklaces, and bracelets, each piece sitting perfectly in its velvet stand. Danielle stepped inside quietly, her eyes adjusting to the glow. She moved closer to one of the counters, curious about the bracelet she had seen from outside. It was delicate yet bold, with small diamonds arranged in a graceful pattern that reminded her of stars scattered across a midnight sky. Just as she leaned closer to get a better look, a clerk approached her. He was a tall man in a sharp suit, his tie perfectly straight, his shoes polished to a shine. At first glance, he looked professional, but there was something about his expression that was less than welcoming. His smile was small and tight, as if forced, and his eyes scanned Danielle quickly, from her shoes to her tote bag. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice smooth but distant. "Are you looking for something today?" Danielle returned his polite tone with a gentle smile. "Yes, I'd like to see that bracelet, if possible," she said, pointing to the diamond piece in the case. The clerk's eyes followed her finger, and for a moment, his brows rose slightly. He hesitated before responding. "Oh, that one," he said slowly. Then his lips curled into a half smirk, though he tried to hide it. "That bracelet is quite expensive." Danielle's smile didn't fade, but she felt a quiet shift in the air. She had heard words like that before, delivered in the same tone, words that weren't really about the bracelet, but about her. Still, she kept her composure. "I'd like to see it, please," she repeated calmly. The clerk gave a little laugh under his breath, so soft it might have gone unnoticed by someone else, but Danielle caught it clearly. He shook his head slightly and said, "Perhaps I could show you something from our silver collection instead. We have some lovely pieces that are more affordable." The words hung in the air, sharp in their own quiet way. Danielle's hand rested lightly on the glass counter as she studied the clerk's face. His eyes had already moved past her, drifting toward another customer in the store, someone dressed in a designer coat and carrying a brand-name handbag. That small shift of attention told Danielle everything she needed to know. In his eyes, she wasn't a real customer. She was only browsing someone who didn't belong among the diamonds. Danielle felt no anger rise within her. Instead, there was a calmness, a patience born from years of moving through spaces where assumptions were made in the blink of an eye. She had learned long ago that people often judged based on what they saw, not what they knew. And most times, what they saw was only a fraction of the truth. Other customers in the boutique glanced over, sensing the change in tone. A young couple near the rings display exchanged a quick look, then turned back to the clerk and Danielle. No one said anything, but the silence stretched, filled with unspoken tension. Danielle, however, didn't waver. She looked once more at the bracelet glimmering under the light. It reminded her of her journey, of how far she had come, of the nights when she had dreamed bigger than the world around her believed she could. She thought about her younger self, walking past shops like this and wondering if one day she would be the kind of woman who could walk in and point to any piece she wanted. Now, she was that woman, though not in the way anyone watching would have guessed. She turned back to the clerk, her voice as steady as before. "I understand what you're saying," she told him softly, "but I'd still like to see that bracelet, if you don't mind." The clerk blinked at her, as if not expecting her persistence. His smile tightened once more, and instead of reaching for the keys to unlock the case, he gave a small shrug. "Well, I'll have to check with my manager," he said quickly, then walked away without waiting for her reply. Danielle stood there quietly, her hands folded in front of her. She could feel the eyes of the other shoppers on her, curious and uncertain. Some of them probably pitied her, thinking she had just been brushed aside. But Danielle didn't see it that way. She saw it as another moment to observe, to measure, to let the truth of people's behavior show itself. She glanced once more at the diamonds sparkling under the light, their beauty unchanged, their worth unquestioned. She thought about the countless people who walked into places like this, ready to spend, ready to invest, only to be judged by the way they looked or the clothes they wore. She thought about how often value was mistaken for appearance, and how blind that mistake could make people. And so, she waited. Calm, patient, unshaken. She knew something the clerk didn't know, something the manager would soon remind him. She knew that this moment wasn't really about a bracelet. It was about something larger, the quiet power of walking into a room and not needing anyone's approval to prove who you were. The clerk didn't know it yet, but his small smirk, his dismissive tone, and his assumptions were about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. Danielle stood silently near the glass counter, her calm presence contrasting with the nervous energy in the store. The clerk's words still echoed in her mind, something more affordable. She wasn't surprised, she had encountered assumptions like this before. Yet every time it happened, it carried the same sharp sting, like a reminder of how quickly people judged without truly seeing. The clerk returned after a few minutes, his steps brisk, his expression unchanged. Instead of bringing the bracelet as she had asked, he placed a tray of silver bangles on the counter between them. They were lovely in their own way, simple, polished, shining under the store lights, but they weren't what Danielle had come to see. "These are very popular," the clerk said in a cheerful tone that sounded more practiced than genuine. He lifted one of the bangles delicately, as though to prove its charm. "Lightweight, elegant, and much easier on the wallet." Danielle looked at the tray, then back at the clerk. His words carried the weight of assumption, even though he delivered them with a smile. She could feel the unspoken message: this is what you can afford. This is where you belong. Her fingers remained still, resting gently on the counter's edge. "I asked about the diamond bracelet in the other case," she reminded him softly. Her voice was even, almost serene, as though she were asking for nothing more than a glass of water. The clerk chuckled quietly, a sound meant to cover his discomfort. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "Trust me," he said, "that bracelet is far beyond the range of most of our customers. It's not really for casual browsing." Danielle's eyes did not waver. She had lived too many years learning how to face such moments without letting them shake her. Inside, she thought of her grandmother, a woman who had taught her to stand tall with dignity no matter how others treated her. "Don't let their words take away your grace," her grandmother had once told her. That advice lived in Danielle's heart, guiding her now. Other shoppers had noticed the conversation. A woman in a designer coat, who had been admiring a row of diamond rings, glanced sideways at Danielle, curiosity written across her face. A young man standing near the earrings shifted uncomfortably, pretending to study the display while clearly listening. The boutique was not crowded, but the air had grown heavier, filled with unspoken awareness. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue or protest. Instead, she simply repeated her request, her tone steady. I would still like to see the bracelet in the other case. The clerk hesitated again. For a brief moment, his mask of professionalism slipped, revealing something close to irritation. He straightened his tie and said with a faint sigh, "Ma'am, I really think it's best if I show you something more suitable." The words landed heavily. More suitable. Danielle let them settle in the space between them, not rushing to respond. She could sense his impatience, his eagerness to move on to another customer who, in his eyes, seemed more promising. But Danielle did not move. She stood firmly, her presence quiet but unshaken. Inside, she felt a deep well of strength, one built over years of building her life, her business, her identity. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But each time it happened, she understood that the lesson was never hers to learn, it was theirs. The clerk, still uncomfortable, finally set down the silver bangle he had been holding. "If you're truly interested," he said with a small shrug, "I suppose I could ask my manager." His tone suggested he doubted she was serious. Danielle gave a gentle nod. "That would be fine." He walked away again, leaving her alone at the counter. The silence stretched longer now, heavier than before. Danielle could feel the curious eyes of the other customers lingering on her. She didn't meet their stares. Instead, she let her gaze drift once more to the diamond bracelet, still locked safely behind the glass, untouched and gleaming. In that quiet moment, her thoughts wandered back to earlier years. She remembered walking into stores as a young woman, unsure of herself, feeling out of place in spaces where people seemed to decide her worth before she even spoke. Back then, she had often left quickly, retreating before the sting of judgment could deepen. But over time, she had grown. She had built her confidence piece by piece, the way one builds a strong foundation beneath a home. Now, she stood differently, anchored, secure, unshaken by assumptions. She thought about how many others had likely faced the same kind of dismissal. How many people had been told, through words or gestures, that they didn't belong in certain spaces. How many had walked away, carrying the weight of those silent judgments with them. Danielle's heart softened with that thought. It wasn't only about her, it was about anyone who had ever been unseen, underestimated, or set aside. The minutes passed slowly, but Danielle remained still, her patience steady. She didn't fidget or sigh. She didn't glance at the door or check her watch. She knew that waiting sometimes spoke louder than rushing. Waiting with dignity was its own quiet power. Finally, the clerk returned, his expression carefully neutral. "My manager will be with you shortly," he said. The words were polite, but his tone lacked warmth. Danielle nodded once more, offering no comment. She didn't need to. The story was already unfolding exactly as it was meant to. Around her, the boutique carried on. The woman in the designer coat was now trying on a diamond ring, her laughter light and easy as she chatted with another clerk. The young man by the earrings had moved on, though his eyes still flickered toward Danielle now and then, curiosity unshaken. The store's soft music played on, calm and unbothered, as though nothing unusual had occurred. But for Danielle, the moment held weight. It was not the jewelry that mattered most, nor even the clerk's dismissal. What mattered was the quiet strength she carried, the way she refused to let anyone's assumptions write her story for her. She stood not only for herself but for every person who had ever been told, in words or in silence, that they didn't belong where they stood. As she waited for the manager, Danielle breathed slowly, letting her patience anchor her. She knew the next few minutes would change the air in the boutique. The truth of who she was would soon come to light, and when it did, it would speak louder than anything the clerk had said. But for now, she remained still, calm as a mountain, her presence unshaken by the dismissal she had just faced. The lesson was not hers, it belonged to the one who had underestimated her. And that lesson was Danielle waited patiently by the counter, her posture calm and steady. The store's soft music drifted in the background, but beneath it, there was a silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. She knew the manager would appear soon. She also knew that when he did, everything in the boutique would shift. The clerk who had dismissed her stood a few steps away, pretending to reorganize a display of rings. His movements were quick, almost restless, but his eyes occasionally flicked toward Danielle. He seemed uneasy, as though he sensed something he couldn't yet name. His earlier confidence, that little smirk of certainty, was fading. Danielle, however, remained unshaken. She didn't need to speak or move to hold her ground. She simply stood there, her quiet patience becoming its own kind of power. She thought of all the years she had worked, the late nights she had spent building her business, the risks she had taken that most people never saw. Everything she had built was rooted in moments like this, moments where others doubted her, where she chose to rise above rather than shrink away. The sound of footsteps broke the silence. The manager, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and a sharp navy suit, entered the boutique from the back office. His face carried a practiced smile, the kind that came from years of serving high-profile clients. But the moment his eyes landed on Danielle, the smile changed. It softened, warmed, and carried a respect that was genuine. "Miss Johnson," he said quickly, his voice rising with recognition. He hurried forward, his hands clasped together in greeting. "I wasn't expecting you today." What a pleasant surprise. Every customer in the store turned their heads. The clerk froze where he stood, his eyes widening in disbelief. His hand, which had been adjusting a small display card, went still. Danielle offered the manager a polite nod, her expression composed. "Good afternoon," she said gently. Her tone was calm, without a trace of pride or anger. The manager gestured toward the case where the bracelet rested. "Would you like to see something specific?" he asked, his voice careful, respectful. "Yes," Danielle replied evenly, her gaze shifting briefly to the clerk before returning to the manager. "I was interested in seeing that bracelet, but it seems there was some hesitation." The words were simple, but their weight was unmistakable. The manager's face paled slightly. He turned his head sharply toward the clerk, who now looked small and uncertain. The silence stretched as the meaning of Danielle's words settled into the air. Without wasting a second, the manager hurried to unlock the case. His hands trembled slightly as he reached inside and lifted the bracelet with delicate care. The diamonds caught the light, sending tiny sparks across the glass counter. He laid it gently on a velvet pad in front of Danielle, as though presenting something priceless not just in value, but in meaning. Danielle's eyes lingered on the bracelet. She studied it quietly, appreciating the craftsmanship, the way each stone had been set with precision. But even as she admired it, her thoughts drifted back to the moment just before, when she had been dismissed, when she had been told she belonged somewhere else. The contrast between then and now could not have been sharper. The clerk, still rooted in place, finally found his voice. I'm so sorry, ma'am," he stammered, his earlier confidence gone. His words were quiet, almost swallowed by the weight of the moment. "I didn't realize." Danielle lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes. She didn't raise her voice or let anger seep into her tone. Instead, she spoke with a calmness that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "That is the problem," she said softly. "You didn't realize, because you didn't see me for who I am. You saw only what you chose to see." The clerk's face turned pale, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth. Other customers exchanged quiet looks, some nodding as if they, too, understood the lesson unfolding before them. The woman in the designer coat shifted uncomfortably, her ring still on her finger, but her attention fixed fully on Danielle now. The manager, desperate to mend the situation, stepped forward. "Please accept our apologies, Miss Johnson," he said sincerely. "This should never have happened. We value your presence here." Danielle gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Her eyes returned to the bracelet, resting on the velvet pad like a quiet witness to everything that had unfolded. She reached out gently, her fingers brushing against the cool metal. It sparkled brilliantly, but in her mind, it wasn't just jewelry anymore. It was a reminder of how easily people made assumptions, and how often those assumptions revealed more about them than about the person they judged. For a moment, Danielle allowed herself to imagine her younger self standing in this very place, watching this scene unfold. She imagined that younger woman learning, through this single moment, that dignity and self-worth were not given by others, they were carried within. She set the bracelet back on the velvet pad with care, her decision made. It wasn't about the purchase anymore. It was about the truth that had already been revealed. Her eyes lifted once more, resting briefly on the clerk, then on the manager. "Respect is more valuable than anything you sell in this store," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of wisdom. Everyone in the boutique seemed to feel them settle in the air, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than applause. The clerk swallowed hard, his apology still hanging in the air. The manager bowed his head slightly, as though accepting a lesson he hadn't expected to learn that day. And the customers, though silent, knew they had witnessed something important, something that would stay with them long after they left the store. Danielle stepped back from the counter, her expression still calm, her presence unshaken. She had come to see a bracelet, but she had revealed something far more powerful. She had reminded everyone in that boutique, clerk, manager, and customer alike, that worth could not be measured by clothing, handbags, or assumptions. True worth walked quietly, carrying itself with dignity, needing no approval to shine. And in that moment, the jewelry wasn't the brightest thing in the room. Danielle was. The diamond bracelet rested on the velvet pad, shining quietly under the store's soft lights. Danielle stood in front of it, calm and composed, while the manager lingered nearby, watching her carefully. The clerk stood a little farther back, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a nervous stiffness. He had never expected the afternoon to unfold this way, and now every second seemed to press heavily on him. Danielle's fingers brushed lightly over the bracelet one more time. She admired it not only for its beauty but also for what it represented in that moment. To her, it was no longer just a piece of jewelry, it had become a mirror reflecting the way people judged, assumed, and underestimated. She lifted her gaze slowly, first to the manager, then to the clerk. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle, but each word carried the weight of truth. "You see," she began, "when you assume what someone can or cannot afford, you don't just risk losing a sale. You risk losing something far greater: respect." The words floated through the boutique, landing softly yet firmly in every corner of the room. The manager bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the truth in her statement. The clerk's face flushed, and he shifted on his feet, unable to meet her eyes. Danielle continued, her tone calm, never harsh. "People don't always walk in wearing their wealth on their sleeves. Value doesn't always look the way you expect. And when you treat someone as though they don't belong, you don't just close a display case, you close a door." The clerk swallowed hard, his lips parting as though to apologize again, but Danielle didn't pause for him. Her words weren't meant to embarrass, they were meant to teach. "I didn't come here today to test anyone," she said softly. "I came here because I saw something beautiful in the window and wanted a closer look. But in just a few moments, I was told what I could and could not afford, without anyone asking who I was, without anyone taking the time to know me." Her eyes shifted briefly to the other customers, who were now listening more openly, their own shopping forgotten. Danielle wasn't addressing just the clerk anymore, her words carried a wider message, one that touched everyone in the store. "You never know who is standing in front of you," she continued. "It could be a teacher who saves for months to buy a gift. It could be a parent trying to make a child's birthday special. Or it could be someone who has worked their whole life to build something greater than anyone expected. Every person deserves to be treated with respect, no matter what you assume about them. The boutique was silent, except for the faint music still playing overhead. Even that seemed quieter now, as though the store itself was listening. Danielle's gaze returned to the clerk, who finally forced himself to look at her. His eyes were wide with regret, his earlier dismissive smirk long gone. He opened his mouth again, but no words came out. His apology was already written across his expression. The manager, standing stiffly by the counter, finally spoke. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice low and respectful, "you are absolutely right. And I cannot express enough how deeply sorry I am for the way this was handled." Danielle nodded, accepting his words but not letting them erase the lesson that needed to remain. "This isn't about apologies," she said gently. "This is about understanding. It's about making sure that no one else who walks through this door feels less than they are because of an assumption." Her words carried no anger, no bitterness. They were steady, thoughtful, and firm, like water wearing away stone. The clerk lowered his head, his shoulders hunched. He whispered, "I understand," his voice quiet but sincere. Danielle let a small silence rest between them, long enough for the lesson to settle. Then, with a calm steadiness, she added the truth that changed the air completely. "And in this case," she said softly, "you didn't just risk offending a customer. You offended the person who owns this very store." The words landed like a spark in dry air, and the effect was immediate. Gasps rippled quietly through the boutique. The customers who had been listening with curiosity now looked stunned, their eyes widening as they turned toward Danielle with new awareness. The clerk's face drained of all color. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. His earlier dismissal now felt heavier, almost unthinkable, knowing who she truly was. The manager, too, stood frozen for a moment, though he already knew her identity. Still, hearing her say it out loud brought the reality crashing into the room with undeniable force. He bowed his head deeply, his respect now bordering on reverence. Danielle's voice remained calm, even gentle, but there was strength in every word. "When you look at someone, see them for who they are, not for what you assume. That is the real jewel of a place like this. That is what makes a store worth entering." The clerk whispered another apology, this time with tears just barely forming at the corners of his eyes. He looked smaller now, humbled not by anger or punishment but by the weight of his own mistake. Danielle didn't prolong the moment. She didn't need to. The lesson had already been delivered. She reached down, gently placed the bracelet back on the velvet pad, and straightened her posture. The store seemed to breathe with her as she stepped back. Customers who had been pretending to browse now watched openly, some with admiration, others with quiet reflection. The air was filled not with diamonds and glitter, but with the undeniable presence of dignity. Danielle glanced once more at the clerk, then at the manager. "This isn't just a business," she said softly. "It's a place where people come with hope, with joy, with dreams. Treat them with the respect they deserve, and this store will shine brighter than any diamond you display." With that, she offered a final nod, her grace leaving no space for bitterness. She had spoken her truth, and the room had listened. As she turned to leave, the boutique seemed different than when she had entered. The customers no longer looked at her with curiosity, they looked at her with respect. The clerk stood still, his lesson learned in the most unforgettable way. And the manager watched her with a mix of admiration and humility, understanding that he had just witnessed something far greater than a simple shopping visit. Danielle walked toward the door, her steps unhurried, her presence dignified. The bracelet still sparkled in the case, but it no longer mattered. The brightest lesson in the boutique that day was not locked behind glass, it walked out the door with her. And as she left, the silence she left behind was not empty. It was full of reflection, full of change, and full of the quiet power of respect. The door of the boutique opened with a soft chime as Danielle stepped outside. The afternoon sunlight washed over her, warm and golden, wrapping her in a glow that no diamond in the store could match. Behind her, the boutique remained silent, filled with customers, a manager, and a clerk who would not forget what had just taken place. Danielle's steps were slow and unhurried as she moved down the sidewalk. She carried no shopping bag, no new piece of jewelry, but she carried something far more valuable, the knowledge that she had left behind a lesson that would echo long after she was gone. Inside the boutique, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The clerk still stood stiffly near the counter, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his mistake. He replayed the moment in his mind, her calm words, her quiet dignity, and the shocking truth of who she really was. He had judged her too quickly, and now the embarrassment of his error burned deeply. The manager, still shaken, gave instructions in a hushed voice. "Make sure every customer here is treated with care," he told the staff. "No more assumptions. Ever." His words were firm, but he knew that Danielle's message had already spoken louder than anything he could say. The customers lingered for a while, whispering quietly among themselves. Some nodded in agreement, others looked thoughtful, and a few glanced back toward the door where Danielle had left. They had witnessed something unusual, something powerful, and it was a story they knew they would carry with them, perhaps even share with others later. Meanwhile, Danielle continued her walk, her heart calm. She didn't feel anger toward the clerk. Instead, she felt a quiet hope that he would learn and grow from the moment. Life had taught her that people sometimes needed to see themselves in a mirror before they could change. Today, she had held that mirror up for him. As she walked, she thought back to her own journey, the long road that had led her here. She remembered the early days of her career, the times when people had dismissed her ideas, when they had doubted her ability to succeed. She remembered nights spent working long hours, mornings spent chasing opportunities, and the steady climb she had made toward building something greater than herself. Owning the jewelry store had not been her first success, but it was one of the ones that had meant the most to her. She had chosen this particular store because she loved beauty, not just the beauty of diamonds and gold, but the beauty of what they represented when chosen with care. A piece of jewelry could carry memories, love, and milestones. She wanted her stores to be places where people felt valued, no matter who they were. And yet, even in her own store, she had just been reminded that assumptions could cloud judgment. It was a reminder not only for the clerk but for her as well to continue shaping her business into one that reflected her values. Back inside, the clerk sat down quietly in the staff room for a moment, his hands covering his face. He thought about the way he had spoken to Danielle, the way he had smiled while dismissing her, and the way he had believed he was being helpful when he was, in truth, being disrespectful. The reality of who she was, his employer, the very owner of the store, only deepened his shame. But beneath the shame was something else, a seed of change. He knew he would never again make the same mistake. Later that evening, when the store closed, the staff gathered briefly. The manager addressed them in a serious tone. "Today we learned a lesson," he said simply. "One that should never be forgotten. Every person who walks through our doors deserves respect, no matter what they look like, no matter what they wear. We don't sell jewelry, we serve people. And without respect, there is no service worth giving." The clerks nodded, some silently, some with quiet words of agreement. The message had sunk in. Danielle's presence, her calm words, and her dignity had left a mark deeper than any policy or rule could ever enforce. For the customers who had been there that day, the story traveled. One woman told her friend later over dinner about the elegant lady who had owned the entire store. Another shared it with her husband, saying how remarkable it was that someone with such quiet grace had taught such a strong lesson without raising her voice. Word spread in small ripples, each retelling carrying the same sense of respect and admiration. Danielle, meanwhile, returned home that evening to her quiet space. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the sun set beyond the horizon. The sky turned shades of pink and gold, reminding her of the jewelry she had seen earlier, though far more breathtaking in its natural beauty. She thought of the clerk again, not with bitterness, but with hope. She imagined him the next day, greeting each customer with genuine warmth, learning to look beyond clothes and appearances. She hoped he would remember that behind every face was a story, and behind every story was value. As the days turned into weeks, the boutique slowly changed. The staff carried themselves with a new attentiveness, treating every person with kindness. Customers noticed the difference, and word spread that the store wasn't only a place of luxury but also a place of welcome. Danielle's quiet lesson had reshaped the very spirit of the boutique. The clerk, humbled by his mistake, worked harder than ever to earn back trust, not just from Danielle but from himself. He greeted each visitor warmly, listened carefully, and no longer measured anyone by what they wore. His co-workers noticed the change, and in time, so did Danielle. When she visited again weeks later, the same clerk approached her with respect in his eyes. "Welcome back, Miss Johnson," he said quietly, this time without hesitation, without assumption. His voice carried sincerity, and his smile was genuine. Danielle gave him a nod of acknowledgement, seeing the growth in him. That moment reminded her of something she had always believed: sometimes people need to stumble before they can truly learn to walk with care. And sometimes, the most powerful lessons are not taught by anger, but by grace. In the end, the story of that afternoon became more than just an encounter in a jewelry store. It became a reminder that dignity is priceless, that respect is a form of wealth anyone can afford to give, and that true strength doesn't always roar, it often speaks softly, carrying wisdom in its quiet words. Danielle hadn't bought the bracelet that day, but she had left something behind that was far more valuable, a lesson that would shine brighter than any diamond in the store. And as life moved forward, the boutique, its staff, and even its customers carried that lesson with them, each in their own way. They had witnessed the quiet power of a woman who walked in wearing simplicity but left carrying the undeniable brilliance of respect.